Hello and welcome to the Alpha Transform Tuesday webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software. And if you joined us last week, you probably know that we have a beta version of Alpha Transform coming out imminently. So keep an eye on email from us within the next couple of days because we are just about there. So I'm very excited to report. Today we'll be talking though about something completely different. We're going to be talking today about using TransForm again in an IoT application. And this time we're going to be talking instead about using Python, but using a new technology, well, not that new, but probably new to a lot of you guys, called Code Red, or Node Red, I should say. So let's get started. Of course, what I'll do here is give you an overview. I'm going to give you a demonstration afterwards, but I'm also here to answer questions. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type those questions into the GoToWebinar control panel. There we go. It looks like Sarah Mitchell has joined us today, so I'm going to go ahead. Sarah Mitchell is our Director of Customer Success. She'll also be here to answer questions. Hello there, Sarah. All right, so let's get going. So we had talked in this series, it's called the Alpha Transform IoT series, and we've done a similar presentation. I did an intro to using Python with Transform. Today we're going to use Node Red, which is a neat technology, and we'll get into that. So starting right here at the basics, we had talked in prior episodes about using a microcontroller or microcomputer, such as this Raspberry Pi here, connected to sensors to actually collect data instead of having humans enter in that data and send that data back to Alpha Transform Central, where Alpha Transform Central becomes our system of record. You can use that to make dashboards, create reports, trigger workflows, and do all kinds of other stuff based on the data that's collected automatically over here on this side. To do that, we actually created a middleware, a web service piece in between using Alpha Anywhere, a companion product to Alpha Transform. How it worked was back on the Raspberry Pi side or the client side, the microcontroller, it would send over, making an HTTPS request, a series of JSON data. In this case, it was just temperature and humidity. That was passed to the web service. The web service then took it, put it into a format that Alpha Transform would understand, set it over to Alpha Transform. Alpha Transform then either successfully adds the data or doesn't, but either way, it reports back what happens to the web service, and the web service reports it back to our script. Now, we'd used Python before. Again, we're not going to be using Python today, but the principle is exactly the same. We're going to send over some JSON data, first to the cloud, and then to Alpha Transform, and then back. Now, on the Transform side, we've created a form whose job is, we've called it IoT Sensors, whose job is just to collect that data. And here it just has two fields, just temperature and humidity. In a more fleshed out example, we probably want to also include a date timestamp and some other information as to when the information was collected, because this may be an aggregate. It might be multiple readings that we submit at the same time. Okay, so moving back from Alpha Transform, we're going to talk today a little bit about the middle layer, which is something I kind of glossed over in the previous episodes. So the middle layer, this is the Alpha Web Service layer. I don't want to go too much into, all right, what's going on with my mouse here? Sorry about that. So we won't go too much into programming, but you'll see the programming to build the web service is actually pretty simple. And I'm going to review it for you right here. Now we have other, if you're interested in Alpha Anywhere, we actually have quite a few videos on Alpha Anywhere, including some specifically aimed at building web services. In fact, I believe tomorrow, our next Wednesday webinar is going to be talking about web services, but how to secure them and provide authentication. So today we've built this web service, and in this web service, it has an endpoint called submit data. And that was done by writing an XBasic class. XBasic is the programming language of Alpha Anywhere. And I'll show you what that script looks like. It's pretty simple. It begins at the top by taking the context request body. That is the information that has been sent to the REST service, and it's being sent in JSON format. And it's parsing that using our JSON parse function, and it's returning the results into R. So if I had a field in my context request body called temperature, I'd be able to refer to that field as r.temperature. Likewise, if I had sent over something called humidity, I could do r.humidity. Now, the problem is working with web services, you never know, what data you may actually be sent. So it's good to scrub the data on the way in. So what I've done here is I've set two variables, one called temperature and one called humidity. And I've used this eval valid function to make sure that there really is an r.temperature. After all, I don't want my script to give an error. Instead, I want it to fail either silently or in some sort of elegant way. And what we'll have it do here is, if there is no temperature, just leave the temperature blank is all we're going to do. We'll still write the record, but we'll leave the temperature blank. The same is true for the humidity. So at the end, I've got these two variables that will either contain the temperature and humidity as passed into the context object, or it will contain blanks. Next up, I've created another variable called post data, and I use this syntax so I can define it as a multi-line string. And this is the data that I'm actually going to pass over to Alpha TransForm. This is in the format that TransForm understands. TransForm doesn't know anything about temperature and humidity. It knows things about form IDs and the person who submits it. And then here in the form data JSON, that's where you specify this type of data here. And I've done that, and I've left some placeholders here in this string, which I then replace in these next two lines using the string trans function. So what ends up happening is my string is formatted the way I want, and it contains the valid temperature and humidity values that I got from the context request body, provided that they were sent over there to begin with. Once that's done, it's a simple matter to write the form instance to TransForm. In fact, it's so simple, I'm not going to show it to you. I've showed it to you before, and that's done automatically using Alpha Anywhere, using the onSubmit builder. Oh, actually, I'll show you where that is. Let's pop over here to one of my Windows machines. Okay, we'll cancel out of that. And we're going to go ahead and show you Tools, Alpha TransForm API Explorer. This is an Alpha Anywhere, which you can download for free of charge, the Community Edition. And in that, you've got the ability to use any one of these functions and sort of build them out in this interface and use the API results. I've covered this in other things before, but I just going to point out where it is. All right, so I've closed that down. Great. Let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so once that's done, back up a couple slides, that means that the temperature and humidity has been set up to the web service. The web service has pulled it out of the request header. It's formatted in a way that Alpha TransForm understands it. Alpha TransForm then gets that and sends the data back to the web service, and we get it back on the other side there. So how do we do that? How do we send that data to Alpha TransForm to begin with? Now is where we come into Node-RED. So Node-RED builds itself as a low-code programming platform, I guess, for event-driven applications. So you're thinking low-code programming, that kind of sounds like Alpha Anywhere, if you're familiar with it, but trust me, it really is very, very different. But I'll show you why it's good for this particular type of programming called event-driven programming. Node-RED is not only just a programming platform, but it can also work as an MQTT node. That stands for Message Queuing Telemetry Transport. It is a standard that was created in 1999, and it's a very simple standard for sharing information between different devices on a network. And it can communicate right over a TLS, a standard, like an HTTPS connection over the internet, basically. How this works is, and I'm not going to go too far into it because MQTT is actually is a huge deal, but to make it, to give you a really simple high-level overview, think about it in terms of one server in the middle called a broker, and then a whole bunch of other computers connected to it called clients. And what happens is a client connects to the broker and says, I'm interested in messages, and I'm interested in messages of this topic. So it subscribes to different topics. When it can then send in a message about that topic or about a different topic. If another computer is also subscribed to that, it will see that message. So it just basically passes right through the broker to anyone who's subscribed to that channel. Imagine it like a CB channel, except you can have tune into multiple channels at the same time. Now, the reason I'm going into this level of detail is because it just helps to understand sort of how Node-RED works in terms of passing messages along, because that's really how you got to really think of it as flow. If you're thinking about it in terms of Alpha Anywhere development or OutSystems or one of the others, it's pretty different. So let's go ahead and dive into that. So we're going to actually pop over here. This is my actual Raspberry Pi computer that I've got here in my office. It's one desk over, and I'm going to connect to it remotely. This Raspberry Pi computer is like the other ones I've shown in the pictures, except for the fact that it has the computer integrated directly into the keyboard. And now we'll go ahead and do a live demo. So I'm going to use live VNC, so virtual VNC viewer, sorry, to go on to the Raspberry Pi computer, which is where we are right here. Now you can see up here that I'm here at the Raspberry Pi, and this is Node-RED, which I have running. If you've got a Raspberry Pi, this comes pre-installed. You just go to Programming, and you choose Node-RED, and you're off. And what it does is it launches Node.js. That's what the node comes from, by the way. So I'm going to pop over here to the Node-RED console. And when you run Node-RED, this window appears here, this terminal window, and it starts up the browser, and it starts up the service. And at the very end, it tells you a URL that you can go to actually get to the interface, to the GUI of Node-RED. And the cool thing about it is I don't just have to I'm not limited to accessing it from just this computer. Any other computer that's on this same network can also access that. You can lock it down so that Node-RED is only accessible from a local host or something like that. But if you're in a trusted network, this is actually a very convenient feature so that you don't always have to be working right at the Raspberry Pi. Right now, for example, I'm working at my Mac, although I'm logged in with VNC. So all you do is you point a browser here, and you're going to get an interface that looks like this: 3 tabs, or 3 sort of panes. The pane on the end are the filter nodes. Think of this as like the palette. These are the things that you can drag over into this flow area, which you could think of as the canvas. And then over here is where you could see system information, debug information. I'll show you some of the useful things you can do here in just a moment. So you're looking at this, and it looks like you're just basically building flowcharts in order to do the programming. And this, I think, is really pretty cool. So let's do a simple sort of hello world example just to get you started into Node-RED. To do that, I'm going to take this node here called the inject node. And the inject node is how you often will begin a Node-RED program. And I'm going to drop it here. And you'll notice when I did, it immediately changed its name from inject to timestamp. Why did it do that? Because it wants to let you know that the value that it's going to inject, the message that it's going to inject, is going to be a timestamp. So remember how I was talking about messages and topics? Well, let's drill down in here and I'll show you what I mean. What this does, this little thing here, is it injects a message. I'm going to double click on it to see its properties. And you'll see that it sets 2 things: a message payload, that's the message, and a message topic, which you can leave blank because we're actually not going to use that feature. So as much as I was talking about the MQTT stuff, it's something that doesn't come up much. I only wanted to bring it up so that you kind of understood the mindset of the Node-RED developer. Okay, so here in this injection code where I set the message payload, it defaults to timestamp, but I have some other choices here. So let's take this drop down, and instead of a timestamp, I'm going to put in a string. And that string is going to say, hello world. And I'm going to say done. And look what's happened. It's now told me that hello world is the message that it's going to inject. I can actually rename this tab, and I find it actually pretty handy to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and say, just type it back to injection, just so you remember what kind of tab it is. So you can name it what you want without messing it up. Now, if I were to go ahead and run this, it would inject a message, but it wouldn't go anywhere. You know, these things go from left to right. So we would have to connect a wire here to something on the other side. And what you'll use is this thing called the debug node. So then again, this is our hello world example here in Node.js. I'll move it up so it's kind of even. And I'm just going to drag a wire from my injection to my message payload. And what debug does is anything you send to debug will appear here in this debug window. It's a good way of testing out code as you're working. Now, that's all in place. There's only one last thing I need to do in order to test this out, and that is that I need to deploy this to Node.js in order to have it work. So to do that, I just hit the deploy button here, and it's deployed. Now the injection node is kind of interesting because it has this little button here on the left. See how this turns into a hand when I click on it? When I mouse over it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to click on this, and what it did was successfully injected, and it successfully injected hello world, which was what the message payload was. So this is hello world in Node-RED, an injection node and a debug node. The injection node, you can specify what the message is, and the debug mode will tell you what the result was here in this window. All right, that's fine, but what does this have to do with TransForm? Well, I will show you. If you recall before, we had used Python to write our temperature and our humidity readings up to an alpha anywhere service. Here we're going to do the same thing using Node-RED. So this time we're going to inject not hello world, but our temperature values, and we're going to do that using JSON. So let me double click here on this inject node and show you how I've set that up. So remember I showed you the different string drop-down types here. It defaults to timestamp, and we use string in the last example. But here, JSON is one of the options. So I chose JSON, and then I just click this little smart button here, and it opens up an interface in which I can specify the JSON, and that's all I had to do. It has a couple nice features built into this. It has a way to format the JSON and to also help make sure that you've entered it properly. And it has a visual editor, which makes it kind of a nicer way to look at the data and lets you expand and collapse the data if you want it. All right, so that's what we're sending. We're sending temperature and humidity. So let's choose, I put in 3.14 before because it was Pi Day, but today is 3.15. If you happen to do your dates that way, like we do in the US, let's say it's a temperature of, it's actually a pretty dry day today. It's about 25% relative humidity. So our payload is going to say it's a temperature of 30, let's say 31.5 degrees, humidity 25. Remember those numbers, all right? You'll be quizzed later, all right? So I'm going to click done. And now that that's done, click done again. I'm going to just go ahead and deploy this to save my changes. And now let's take a look at the next node. Now, instead of having this go directly to the message payload, which would simply show me my results, I want to use a new node called the HTTP request node. So I'm going to scroll down here, and you'll see it's one of the ones that you'll find here under network is HTTP request. That's response, that's request. When you drop in one of these nodes, there's surprisingly little to do. I'm going to double click on that. And the only thing I had to specify in this HTTP request node was the URL of my web service. So this is the URL that I have for my web service on Alpha Cloud. It's HTTPS, so it does work over a secure connection. I don't have to enable secure connection to make that happen. And I don't have to specify the message because if you recall the way Node-RED works, or the thinking behind it is, the message is the thing that gets passed along the wire. So when I send a JSON object down this wire and it hits the HTTP request, the HTTP request knows, I'm supposed to send that message to that URL, to that endpoint. When it gets a response back, so this doesn't just send the message, it also waits to get a response back. It then places what it gets back into this message payload here, which is a debug statement. So you'll see it here on the left. All right, so without any further ado, let's press the button and see what happens. Okay, successfully injected. And you'll see it went through the HTTP request and the message payload. In other words, what it got back was there were no errors, a record was added, and here is the form instance ID of the form that we added into TransForm. Now, I'm sure you trust me that that works, but let's trust but verify. Let's pop over to TransForm and take a look. So I need to get out of VNC Viewer here. Shrink that down. I'm going to open up a web browser. Move there. And here I am in Alpha TransForm. And I'm going to go ahead and click refresh. And I have already selected the type of form that I wanted. So here we go. There we go. And you'll see temperature 31.5, humidity 25. The values we just sent have now been passed right in here. And that's all we had to do to get data to come from Node-RED all the way through to TransForm. We had one simple piece of middleware in between. And the coding in Node-RED, I think you would probably agree, couldn't really be much easier. So let's open this up, and I'm going to show you one other thing because we're going to use this in another upcoming Internet of Things thing. And that is the ability for it to send messages, not by us just pressing a button, but by us getting values that are coming in through digital pins. In other words, things connected right to the computer in the real world. And in this case, I have a library just for this type of computer called the Raspberry Pi library. And what I could do here is I could simply drag in one of these input pins and connect it to my HTTP request if I wanted to, and have it trigger that. Or I could have it take the data, make some sort of transformation using one of these change nodes, and then make my HTTP request after that. So there's all kinds of really neat things that you can do. I think that's it. Let me just quickly review through the list. So I mentioned that the beta is coming soon, so please keep an eye out for it. I talked about what we have done in the past using the Internet of Things and the Industrial Internet of Things, IoT, and reviewed how to do that piece in alpha and how to write the web service. So that's about covers what I wanted to cover today. Are there any questions? There are no questions. Well, keep in mind, you can always send your questions to tfservice@alphasoftware.com. Thanks very much for attending. Thanks, Sarah, for being there. I hope to see you at our next Tuesday webinar. Till then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.